Sivamohan, Valluvan. It goes by Vallu, so I know that it doesn't mind if I just call it Vallu. The format, as you can see, is quite different. It's going to be like more of an interactive, so we'll have 20 minutes first for Tariq, then we'll have another 20 minutes for Vallu, we'll have 5 minutes for each to reply to each other position, because the point, the fact is that they have two different positions when it comes down to engage with diversity. Then we'll open to Q&A at the end. So a few introductions. Professor Tariq Modood is Professor of Sociology and Politics and Public Policy at the University of Bristol. Is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. He has a presence on YouTube, quite many videos on there. I highly encourage you to go on YouTube and check those videos. Very interesting. He wrote so many books and articles, and he's also a public figure, so it's not only academic interventions. But I would like maybe to mention one, also because I know that it's quite, you're quite dear, you're quite close to that publication, which is The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, which maybe started maybe the debate around the issue of multiculturalism in the UK. That was the also called Tariq report, published in 2000, and is a key publication. I would say that obviously with Professor Tariq is the leading figure when we talk about multiculturalism in the UK, besides also being an international figure, internationally well-renowned scholars in the study of multiculturalism. Vallu is presently based at University of Warwick, is associate professor of sociology in there. He has an very rich Say again? I didn't capture that. What did you say?
I also have YouTube videos.
Okay. And he has written extensively on issues of racism, multiculture, and not multiculturalism. And here already I give you a hint of the fact that the two don't share the same position, particularly on cosmopolitanism. And whereas, if I put it correctly, and by the way, correct me if I'm wrong, whereas Tariq comes more from a communitarian, identitarian perspective, this is a position that Vallu criticizes. It's not coming from that intellectual position at all, and that's the reason why the two are together. Last night we were joking, sorry guys, like it's gonna be like in a boxing ring, but obviously we are very respectful of each other, and I obviously encourage you all to be very respectful of the position. It will be a very interesting debate, and I'm looking forward to this debate. So without further ado, there will be 20 minutes first from Tariq. Again, Tariq will have some slides, we'll move here. Then Vallu, the same thing, 20 minutes, 5 minutes each, and then we open for Q&A. Professor Tariq Modood, the floor is to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm mindful that everybody has homes to go to, family waiting for them, travel journeys to make. So thank you very much for staying for this final conference event to hear me and Valluvan address the topic of nationalism and multiculturalism. So, I'm doing something wrong here. That's pressing that one, right? Yeah, great. So that's my center. That's the title. Obviously my contribution expressing my own angle. And I'll begin with my method, because I do have a very distinctive way of approaching the topic, and that in itself might be quite controversial and worth discussing. So I think everybody here will know what we mean by anti-essentialism and probably share that view. Namely, that when we talk about large-scale phenomena, when we use concepts and categories to capture things in the world, like nationalism, like democracy, or even the university, the idea of the university, we don't necessarily use concepts and categories that have a fixed core essence, such that all examples of what's captured by the concept, as it were, like all universities or all democracies, all have this set of essential criteria A, B, C, and whatever they might be. So anti-essentialism is the view that concepts can be meaningful and cogently used without sharing a common essence. I assume we all share that view, perhaps we don't. I certainly hold that view. But there are different versions of anti-essentialism. So the one that I don't share is the next bullet point, which I'm calling, you could call it something else, but I'm calling nominalism, which is the view that actually we can call anything a democracy. It's up to us. There's no kind of core logic that constrains us from calling certain things democracies. So if we want to call the Soviet Union a democracy, or People's Republic of China, or whatever, yeah, it's up to us. Or, with a slight qualification in the brackets, whoever is powerful enough to impose their meaning on a concept, that's the meaning of the concept. Well, that's the view I don't hold. My own interpretation of anti-essentialism is derived from the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argued that the concepts that we use, both simple and complex concepts, when we use them in different contexts or ways, or to point to instances, including new instances where we haven't encountered before, they do follow a logic of use. It's not arbitrary, but this logic of use groups things together which have a certain resemblance to each other, what he called a family resemblance, in the way that members of a family share, some of them share similar eyebrows, some of them share high cheekbones and so on, but they don't all look alike. They're not uniform, but they share some overlapping characteristics, similarities. So that's the anti-essentialism that I approach when I approach concepts like nationalism. However, I do something else, and this is the more distinctive part. I begin with identifying a minimum. I say, well, what is the minimum that something has to have before we can call it a democracy, or a university, or a nationalism, and so on. The minimum doesn't define the whole concept, far from it. Perhaps nothing in the world will exist which is a one-to-one match with the minimum. So the minimum isn't meant to match with any particular instance, with any privileged instances. It's just in order to help group a varied case together, cases that can have some family resemblance. And the cases will vary in all kinds of ways. I say here there'll be a variable expansion because they'll expand in different ways and in different directions. So certain forms of nationalism will have certain kinds of state characteristics, perhaps kind of a republican state characteristic. I mean, like it's in French republicanism. Others will have other characteristics, perhaps to do with religious nationalism, for instance. And what these expansionist characteristics are, the additional to the minimum are quite contingent, meaning we don't know in advance what they are, such that we can predict what they will be and what they won't be. Contingent means things will turn out as they turn out, and we can't limit them to a certain formula, because concepts change, they get expanded, they get extrapolated, and that is part of the normal logic and coherence of concepts. It's not a limitation or a liability. And in brackets, I've given an example, so I don't know, whether you've come across my work in that respect, but this is the approach that I've been using in relation to discussing racisms and in secularisms. So some people, well, let me get on to the nationalism bit. So one implication of this approach of mine is that there's no single fullness or true or real instance of the concept. In this case, nationalism. There can be different kinds of nationalisms. It's not like, oh, this is the true nationalism, all these others are disguised forms of nationalism or fake or second-class versions of nationalism. And I've been using this with secularism and racism, so that, for instance, some people say that, oh, secularism is about separation of church and state in a particular kind of way. And I showed through pointing to a variety of cases, including our own country here, that actually that's not true. Secularism can be varied. And similarly with racism, people think racism is all about biology or color racism and so on. And I say, well, no, it's not. I won't be going into those examples today. I'm just illustrating that I'm trying to use a method in relation to nationalism that I've already been using in relation to other large-scale concepts like secularism and racism. So, turning specifically to nationalism, I'll then define it in this two-step way, the minimal and then the expansion. So, for me, the minimal, and you'll see that it is very thin, the minimal is a societal perspective or a politics that gives normative significance to the national. And then I say, okay, what about all the examples, all the instances in the world, past and present or future, about nationalism? I say, well, yes, this normative significance to the national can be made to connect with other things that have normative significance. Like for some people, their religion obviously has a normative significance for them, and they might want to connect the significance they give to their national, to their nation or country, or however they characterize it, they might want to connect it to their religion. Others may not. Other people have a normative significance in relation to, let's say, individual freedom, and they might want to connect that to the idea of we are a free nation, or we're a nation of free people, or whatever. So that's how a particular example of nationalism will get elaborated and expanded, because they'll connect different normative features, different things that they value to each other, and in particular to the national. And putting it crudely, the more things they connect with, the more nationalist will be the concept. That's a little bit crude, but I'll leave it like that. But I do want to emphasize the very last point there. There'll be no single end point of which we'll say, oh, well, that's now the true nationalism or real nationalism. So we will have a genuine multiplicity of cases, a genuine variety. And some implications of what I believe I'm saying is that nationalism is varied, and to accept one kind is not to necessarily accept another. So it's not the case that we could define all possible positions in terms of pro-nationalist and anti-nationalist. Nationalists, within my framework, will disagree with each other, perhaps just as much as they'll disagree with non-nationalists or anti-nationalists and so on. So just because someone's a nationalist, it doesn't mean they accept all possible nationalisms. In fact, that's never happened, and the idea doesn't make any sense that they would. We know that they disagree with each other, and that different kinds of nationalisms are actually logically incompatible with each other. Moreover, another implication is that othering, creating a group, whether it's a minority within your country or an outside group or groups, and saying we are this because they are something else, othering or exclusion is involved in some kinds of nationalism. I think we all are aware of that, but is not, you'll see, is not part of the core definition, and importantly, does not capture the normative character of nationalism. So if someone said, oh, I know what nationalism is, it's all about othering and exclusion, I'd have to say, no, that's not what nationalism is about, because you haven't yet got your finger on the normative significance of nationalism, because it must have normative significance to its advocates, perhaps not to its opponents, but to its advocates. No one would be a nationalist if they didn't think it was something important and valuable, something to be advocated and promoted. So it's the normative character of nationalism that we have to first understand before we can look at other contingent aspects of it. So what about the normative connections that I want to make? Okay, so here are four that connect the idea of the national to the state, to citizenship, to belonging. And that's really pretty common. There's nothing original about that whatsoever. But nevertheless, I want to do that as well, just as quite a lot of other people do. What's distinctive about what I'm doing is number 4. I want to connect not only the national to state, citizenship and belonging, I also want to connect it to the idea of multicultural recognition or inclusion. The idea that minorities or identity groups in general have to be respected and included within a conception of the national. And I'll obviously say quite a lot more about that. For the moment, all I'll just say is that all of the above have some historical cultural character. They must have some historical cultural character, because it's impossible to have a state, in my opinion anyway, to have a state which is culturally contentless. It must use a language. It'll have a history. It'll have all kinds of cultural reference points and so on. And so the idea that the state is in some ways culturally neutral is a fiction, is an impossible idea. But all those things cannot be reduced to rights. So, liberal conception of rights, whatever it is, individual rights or even individual plus collective rights. And so I want to say the kind of thing I'm arguing for, multicultural nationalism, is culturalist. You see I put that in quote marks because different people might have different meanings for that. And for some people it's already a negative anyway, so I'll put it in quote marks. But it's a culturalist as well as a civic nationalism. On the whole, I don't work with that distinction, ethnic, civic, culturalist, civic. I just really want to say it's both. So let me now say something about this multiculturalism to explain how it can be connected to nationalism. So part of the normative core of multiculturalism are two concepts of equality. And this slide is about the first concept, which is in some ways a classical liberal concept of equality, certainly within that family of concepts. And so I say firstly we should understand it in terms of equal rights, non-discrimination. If Christians are allowed to do this, why aren't Muslims? If white people enjoy certain kinds of opportunities, why don't people who are not white enjoy those opportunities? So there's nothing radically new in that. I think we all understand the idea of non-discrimination and sameness of treatment. But I do want to say something about it which is often overlooked, namely that this first concept, uniformity of treatment, can be interpreted in two different ways, A and B. So A is what I call equalizing downwards. And it is sometimes interpreted like this in practice. And I give an example. Supposing someone says, well, Christians have all kinds of privileges in British society, like state funding for schools, or at least at one time only Christians had that. That's not the case today. But the role of the Anglican Church, for instance, in the coronation that's about to take place in a month's time and so on. So we can think of all kinds of examples, and someone might say, well, that's not egalitarian. Why should one group of people or one institution have these kinds of privileges? Let's get rid of those privileges. That's what I mean by equalizing downwards. So anyone who seems to have anything above the line or above other people, you bring them down. So if Muslims complain about why are Christians privileged, you say, oh, don't worry about that, we will unprivilege them. But it's interesting that very few Muslims are satisfied with that answer. They don't feel somehow they're being treated with equality and respect when they're told that Christians will be disprivileged. And that brings into play then the second way of employing this concept, equalizing upwards, which is giving Muslims and others the same provision as currently enjoyed by Christians. So for example, if we have school holidays marked by Christian holidays, like we're about to have Easter, well, why not Eid? Why not Diwali? Why not Hanukkah, and so on? So that's what we would be saying is equalizing upwards. Bringing those people who currently don't enjoy certain provisions into line with those who do enjoy them. That's a form of equality. So that's equalizing upwards. And the multiculturalist presumption is to consider the possibility of B, of upwards, oh my God, before A, downwards, to avoid any form of downwards movement or loss of dispossession. When I said, oh my God, it's because I just had a sign flashed in front of me which said 5 minutes. Okay, so I don't know what I'm going to do, but I obviously have to leave a few things out. I'll just tell you what the second concept of equality is, and then I'll edit the rest of the talk. Because you do need to know this, because this is the most distinctive contribution of multiculturalism to normative thinking. The second concept of equality. Equality as respect for difference, which can require differential treatment, as the important thing is to focus on a group's needs, as well as on what provision is generally available. For example, Christians have no dietary needs that are met at school. They used to, no fish on Thursday, no meat on Friday, but we forget about that because they don't exercise it anymore. But that is not a reason to deny Muslims and Jews kosher or halal meals at school if they ask for it. So the French state says that's a form of discrimination. It's privileging Muslims and Jews. For the multiculturalists, that's a form of equality because it's treating all groups in terms of their needs and not treating Muslims and Jews by using a Christian template, by saying, well, what do Christians need? Okay, Muslims and Jews, you'll get the same. That's not multicultural equality. Having said that, and what should I now do for the remaining 4 minutes? Well, I'll have to just very quickly go through some of this. So I unpack multicultural equality by reference to 4 features which you can read on the screen probably faster than I can read them out. And it may be that I'll have to spell them out in more detail in discussion with Valluvan or with response to your questions and comments. But here's 2. These are, for me, parts of what I mean by multicultural equality. And I perhaps just underline, in number 1, you can see protection of minorities against certain forms of majority exclusion, hegemony, domination, and so on. But the bit at the end in brackets is very important, but not the majority culture per se. There's nothing about multiculturalism that's anti-majority culture. It's about the relationship between the majority culture and minority culture within an inclusive national identity. It's not about being anti-majority culture or anything like that. So the other 2 aspects of multicultural equality are on this slide. And is there something I should really emphasize? Well, I think number 4 is very important because for me, multiculturalism is incomplete without number 4. But it is a kind of an advanced stage of multiculturalism. We can't begin with that. It usually takes quite a lot more thinking and mobilizing and critical engagement and so on, contestation of ideas before we properly begin to rethink an inclusive national identity, i.e. to multiculturalize our national identity. But that is what I'm arguing for. That is what multicultural nationalism includes. So I'll quickly mention it. I then go on to distinguish my own view from the views of people who say they're liberal nationalists, like say David Miller. So what are the differences between someone like me and liberal nationalists? 2 things. Liberal nationalism is not about group recognition. My version clearly is, including ethno-religious groups, because on the whole, liberal nationalists tend to be focused on individual rights or questions of redistribution and welfare, or secularized public spaces, which aren't at the center. Those projects are not at the center of multicultural nationalism. And then you have someone like Will Kimlicka, who clearly is a multiculturalist, but he too says he is in favor of liberal nationalism because he says he advocates the thinning of the national culture so that minorities are not alienated by aspects of the national culture. Let's thin it down. I say no, we don't thin it down. We remake it to include the minorities. And that follows my principle of equalizing upwards, not equalizing downwards. You don't include minorities by dispossessing other people, unless, of course, there are aspects of exclusion, like racism and so on, in that particular aspect of majority practice or symbolism or whatever. And so that finally takes me to my very last slide. Sorry about the rush. Which is that I think multicultural nationalism is not just a good idea, it's actually a feasible alternative, a practical, contemporary alternative to what I'll crudely call bad nationalism, populist, right-wing, monocultural, majoritarian nationalism. Because it's based on valuing collective, non-economic identities that are important to people and are consistent with equal citizenship. So that, that's my understanding of multicultural nationalism. And multicultural nationalism unites the concerns of some of those who are currently sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism, because it, argues we don't need to be hostile to majority culture per se, only its exclusionary aspects. So it unites the concerns of people who are sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism and those who are pro-diversity. I'm not so naive as to think that all majoritarian nationalisms will be cheering multicultural nationalism and say hallelujah. But there are people across the spectrum, including we see from opinion poll surveys about the electorate in Britain. So there are people who can be won over, who have certain sympathies in both directions, for instance. And therefore, multicultural nationalism represents the political idea and tendency most likely to offer a feasible alternative to monocultural nationalism. Because I think we all will agree that monocultural nationalism is a very big challenge, and we do need feasible alternatives to monocultural nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Valluvan, please. Vallu, you have 20 minutes.
So, thank you for the invite. Though Marco seemed to present this as a pugilistic affair, it really isn't. I think, to be honest, we're going to be speaking entirely at cross purposes, insofar as I don't think I'm going to entertain an ideal theory, the formulations of various permutations of the relationship between a liberal affordance to the multicultural state vis-a-vis the possibilities of affordances of nationalism. But I have no grief with Tariq in many ways about how he staged a long, distinguished, and important debate and tradition around multiculturalism. There are many things from it that is still enduring and relevant to a lot of my life in terms of our thinking, the circles that I keep close company with. For not least, something you alluded to, the forceful and much overdue interrogation of the secular ideal, that secularism, that is masked neutrality, or rather its purported neutrality actually masked a very particularity, usually modeled in a particular kind of drift of Protestant liberal democratic culture, but therein got amplified as the universal ideal. I think Tariq and his circles have been very forceful in helping see through some of the secularism conceits. I think indirectly Tariq's work and some of the people associated with you have helped profile the sheer centrality of Islamophobia to the racisms and the particular nationalist cultures that afflict much of Western Europe, not least Britain, but much of Western Europe more broadly. I know it's not necessarily a headline theme for you, but that kind of wider interrogation of the overdetermined place of Islamophobia in Western European life was something I think you indirectly cued for the rest of us. And of course, there is a lot about how multiculturalism debates were initially staged that helped understand the importance of some kind of diversification or representation of culture, that this has real merits, and in fact, this is a progressive ideal that most anti-racism should champion. Having said that, I honestly come from a very humanities tradition, critical theory tradition. I am unfortunately a lot more left-wing than you, so there are also those implications. I'm also much more formidably located, I don't mean I am formidable, but I'm formidably located in more pronounced contemporary anti-racist conversations, which of course, for better or for worse, have become very high profile. There's a lot of heat, very little light at times, but anti-racism and some of those debates is where I find myself more properly located. So on those terms, we're going to be speaking entirely at cross purposes, but that's okay, because I think we'll find some common themes to share, or at least interrogate during the rest of the discussion. I know honestly, I'm also apologizing because I want to talk a lot about just contemporary British politics and the very particular, not multiculturalism as ideal theory, but multiculturalism as it becomes imbricated in the particularities of British nationalism's hardening or reconsolidated zealotry. I do also use, unfortunately, a pretty flowery, florid Edwardian English. I'm sorry if you find it impenetrable. I can't help myself, but I improvise for the most part, and that's the English that comes most naturally to my tongue in these terms. So, yeah, sorry, you won't understand much, whatever. Anyways, of late I wrote a fairly well-received book, so I suppose my own work, I'm just going to speak through that and then cue in contemporary political impasses. My own work is increasingly centered around the reconsolidation of a kind of sweeping and as of now electorally triumphant brand of British, but more properly put, and I'm aware of some Scottish figures here, but more properly put, English nationalism in this country. And English nationalism that, amongst other indicators of cruelty, is now embarking upon such intense forms of anti-migrant bordering and demagoguery that it is in fact threatening, or it is threatening to conclusively renege on the very possibility of asylum to this country. My father was an asylum seeker. He was given asylum, albeit in Sweden, and via him, my own fate too was settled. In that way, multiculturalism as a debate can seem completely moot. If no one can come here, I don't care. It is of no consequence whether we get our own ship in place in order, if in fact the whole political order chain turns on anti-migration as the overdetermined object of nationalist desire. Of course, just because I am from another part of the world, I do need to say that English nationalism's colonial and racial ills is considerable, but I'm not going to talk about that because that will be a tome in itself, and it'll be boring, and it will derail everything. But just to, I know there's a recording to my own crowd back home, I am aware of those things, but we're not going to touch on those matters. You know, you got to think the guardrails. But instead, I think I'm just going to raise a couple of remarks about a very particular contemporary conjuncture where actually this nationalism as we inhabit also stands to reinvent itself in particular ways that I do think pose certain challenges to some of the conventions commonly attributed to multiculturalism as a politics or a style of political claim-making. So firstly, and what has perhaps changed most noticeably across the last few decades since that kind of multicultural moment, is that the ability of the nation in some important senses to expand its remit of belonging, reconfiguring a more accommodating, distinct, in symbolically multicultural assertion of its otherwise equally reactionary sense of nationalist selfhood. So, if we're really taking stock of the last 30 years since the multicultural movement and what we reckon with today, it is salutary to note the less than white, the less than pale complexion of our governing front bench. I'm frequently surprised how often we're in these debates and this is not discussed. It is quite consequential, I think, that we see who is our Prime Minister, who is in cabinet, so on and so forth. And the active place of brown and black demagogues as emphatic innovators, not bystanders, as emphatic innovators of a post-Brexit UKIPified governing right and all its internal breakdown as well, admittedly. I hasten to add that the prominence of non-white headliners in cabinet and so on can no longer be credibly dismissed as simply some kind of tokenism, which is what some anti-racists still continue to insist. If it is tokenism, they're doing an awful lot of it. It's an absolute windfall of tokens. Some, quite frankly, some Tory party, like some master puppeteer of the Tory party has misplaced the dictionary definition of what a token is because they're doing an incredible amount of it. So really, we've got to kind of reconfigure what we're reckoning with here. So our cabinet, our Prime Minister, I do recall here, akin to you're saying about the religious affordance, I do recall a kind of quite telegenic, photogenic ceremony, a Diwali ceremony, led by Sunak and his billionaire wife outside Downing Street. That is, in its own terms, a significant multicultural moment, or at least a threshold in terms of reconfiguring with a new form of politics, or reckoning with a new form of politics. So our cabinet, our PM, and indeed some aspects of recent referendum and electoral voting patterns, I think can be better construed as essentially a metonym, if you like, a metonym of an emergent reconstitution of the politics of what I would still call British narcissism and fortified cruelty, in ways that no longer can simply be explained as simply a recidivist whiteness. Okay, the call to whiteness is not sufficient to explain the whole of these political stakes. So instead, as the excellent authors, a collective they're not called anything, but they wrote something called Empire Endgame, which I couldn't recommend enough. Half of them are my friends, admittedly, but I would recommend them in their own right for non-nepotistic reasons, insofar as they're the best going in terms of cultural theory, anti-racism, left politics, with taking strong positions. In Empire Endgame, they argue that the task of anti-racism is not to analytically deny the ways in which someone like Priti Patel represents a set of multiracial or multicultural even entry points into the politics of cruel Britannia, but instead the task of anti-racism is to actually adapt, or the task is to adapt our anti-racism so it can better reckon with and foresee that very likelihood. The likelihood where nationalism is reconsolidated, reconfigured in ways where it can absorb multicultural representational coordinates, in still yet asserting and affirming its multiplying fears and aversions to the outside and to those who at any given moment are construed as not belonging, iconically not belonging, be that the migrant, be that the refugee, be that the asylum seeker, be it not least the Muslim against the wider frame of Islamophobia, as I already alluded to, as it anchors so much of British political intuition. Be it the EU, naturally, obviously, be it the spectre of China, which has world historical reckonings. I know in Britain that politics hasn't really taken off yet, but we're seeing it. Even Biden is playing on it in a very heavy way, and we're seeing a centrist version where that's going to be amplified in ways that the naivety of our conversations of, I don't mean here, you guys are very intelligent people, but nonetheless, there's a naivety where we are just putting that on the back burner and not realizing how Western nationalism, and certainly Anglophone transatlanticist nationalism, are going to catch their wind, and all sorts of reckonings and ruptions will unfold on that front. Be it even a general aversion to the deracinated cosmopolitan lefties running amok all over dulcet England and the sweet foothills of provincial England. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've certainly been slandered many, many, many a time as being a allegedly avocado-eating cosmopolitan lefty. Let me tell you, I don't care about avocado or sandwiches. I just eat normal food. But nonetheless, there is that intimation that somehow it is kind of a lifestyle, aloofness, whatever it may be. albeit, of course, a more generalized sense of an internationalism and its specific organs that somehow are construed as kind of being an unbearable albatross that undermines our precious, otherwise intact, otherwise immaculate, self-sufficient, autarkic sovereignty, to steal a phrase from the recent Brexiteer jargon. So that's one form. That's one form. But moving on, so on one form I'm talking about the kind of, not the above diversification, if you like, of a politics of contemporary nationalist conservatism. I do think we should also perhaps pay attention to some of the shifting poetics of reactionary whiteness itself, in ways that I am there to offer those who happen to identify as white a different program, in a way that I don't think multiculturalism is quite there. So namely, we might want to observe how whiteness as anchored to English belonging, which is only one modality of English belonging, but a significant one, but a whiteness as anchored to English belonging is increasingly less formally about privilege and superiority on those things, and it's much more about a poetics of resentful, revanchist melancholia. In other words, as Western economies, and certainly the sorry parlor state of our British economy, our English economy, I know a lot of you are not here, so you can be the quick return to what I hope is more stable infrastructures. But nonetheless, the state of Western European world historical decline. There's not much we can do about it on these terms, but world historical economic decline. And in terms of where the wages of whiteness, to steal a phrase from Du Bois way back, but where the wages of whiteness in its allegedly more literal sense no longer obtain as readily as before. And in those terms, we say a texture of whiteness that is increasingly less about the safeguarding of privileges or superiority per se, but in my mind is much more about the distinctly embittered and unfortunately also the latent fascist possibility that arises amidst the perception or experience of thwarted or frustrated entitlement, that I, as a white English, deserve something better. That thwarted, frustrated, unmoored, displaced entitlement. And where the masochism therein of perceived decline and loss converts, where the masochism converts into the externalized sadism of preoccupations with nationalist identity and nationalist aversion, not least to multiculturalism, as Tariq alluded to in terms of the refortification of majoritarian nationalism. So in other words, we have something akin to, forgive my psychoanalytic thing, I told you I'm from the humanities, so you guys most probably political science people finding it all terribly imprecise, but what not? You're my people, that's good. We need some kindred spirits. My PhD is meant to be here, but he's not here. He was my other kindred spirit. Did he present this Pavan? I don't know where the hell he's gone. He's gone drinking somewhere. What was I saying? Psychoanalysis. No, the notion of the uncanny. As from an anti-racist perspective, it feels like we kind of encounter a certain kind of uncanny dystopia, where one has in fact escaped one whiteness, a whiteness of privilege and supremacism, only to thereupon encounter a new whiteness scored by a new set of psychosocial properties. Psychosocial properties are repertoires of loss, decline, and festering zealous melancholia. Put differently, it seems to me now a harnessing of something called white English pain, often indexed to a symbolism of provincial or town-based geographies. They're completely obsessed with the symbolism of the town, but nonetheless, a provincial town-based geography, where we therein see a texture of English whiteness that is less about the safeguarding of we see a politics of English whiteness that actually doesn't, just merely aspires for a monopoly on the public staging of deserving victimhood, a public monopoly on a staging of deserving victimhood. This is not there in a nationalism that actually expects or presents itself as anything will get better. In fact, they say anything but. It is rather about the righteous dignity of having one's own nationalized pain, the righteous dignity of having one's own nationalist pain visibilized as the only authentic one, and the only pain that is locked into a competitive economy with the pain of others. And that majoritarian logic sits or asserts itself. And particularly this, 5 minutes, you say that, all right.
We'll see.
Oh, you upped the stakes, did you? Well, I better get going. But you know, I am getting somewhere about multiculturalism. Particularly decisive, and this is where I show my more left-wing colors, particularly decisive is the kind of recourse to class that helps anchor this sense of white English victimhood. Consider here now the ubiquitous tropes of claims to the left behind, or what is now increasingly coined as something called the white working class. Of course, this recourse to class is entirely disingenuous, entirely emptied of any materialist content, entirely emptied of any socioeconomic content, entirely indifferent to any notion of class conflict or class struggle. Instead, working class identity becomes selectively repurposed as merely a proxy for a very particular cultural subject. A cultural subject that is to be always provincial, always white, always English, always patriotic, always socially conservative, and of course, not least, always anti-immigration and anti-multiculturalism. For some reason, they claim white people on their terms, on the most disrespectful, condescending, insulting terms. If that is homage, I have no idea what insult looks like. So we have here a culturalization of class that has become very pointed, where class suffering is merely is culturalized as identity, culturalized as aggrieved Englishness, culturalized as nostalgic whiteness. And by that logic, I do fear, and I'm not talking about Tariq's work, I'm talking about where I sit in anti-racism and what a kind of formal style of multiculturalism is. I do fear that a politics of multiculturalism as a kind of normative logic in the public sphere also shares a certain complicity here, where some of the formal 1990s successes of multiculturalism as a style, at least early Blairite styling or patronage of something called multiculturalism, meant that anti-racist claim-making also took on an identitarian and culturalized logic, where one's experience of racism was now about a set of group rights and cultural dignities that were otherwise being denied, that were otherwise being withheld. And this commitment to multicultural and often, you know, a groupist is fine. We can, you know, as you made a point of defense of that, a groupist claim making, whatever its other justified merits, and I believe I try to identify its merits that I think are important nonetheless, not least about the interrogation of Islamophobia, secularism, and representational politics. Whatever its otherwise justified merits, it did nonetheless displace here some other competing anti-racist traditions. Anti-racist traditions that were much more insistent on how the experience of racialization and the experience of migrant status and migrant hardship and migrant demagoguery and migrant hierarchy, that this was also about class outcomes, that we were living out class struggles. I grew up in an estate. It wasn't the cultural rights I was struggling with. It was poverty and the fascists. That was it. I wasn't waiting to go pray somewhere. I could go pray somewhere anyways. You know what I mean? But there were different implications to what that politics and anti-racist tradition was. And they were always also about aspiration to solidaristic class collectivism, where there is a pointed tradition of anti-racist cultural politics, but also trade union politics, or at least activist politics, that did as a gesture routinely try to make common cause with their working class peers who happened to identify as white and English, but to relieve them of the defensiveness of thinking you're white and English, but still trying to maintain class solidarity, or at least the prefigurative terms of class solidarity. And so, in my opinion, I mean, the formal institutionalization, briefly, because we know it's under a lot of stress now, but the formal institutionalization of multiculturalism as a style did unfortunately see, in my opinion, mainstream anti-racism vacate its erstwhile or possible class orientations, which in itself is maybe bad, but it becomes particularly bad because it therein rendered itself vulnerable to English nationalism's subsequent attempt to reclaim class symbolism certainly, as the exclusive preserve, as the exclusive precinct of white English people who are allegedly left unmoored by a socially liberal and multicultural mores of a present. Do I have 2 minutes still?
You do.
Oh, good, all right, let's go. So I'll just very quickly change tack then in that case, just rush a little bit. Obviously I'm presenting quite a resigned, partial view of events. So against these two converging tendencies, one a diversified nationalism, if you like, on the one hand, and the other a melancholic reactionary whitening of class on the other, I just want to allude to a couple quick remarks about, at least in my tradition, and it's not in any way at war with Tariq's position, but in my position, we're perhaps less formally interested in multiculturalism and we remain much more interested in what many people still describe, and I know you don't think much of it maybe, but what many people think of as the actual everyday lived culture of working class people across and through difference, and how those energies remain for us the most important premise in activating political possibility. And this multiculture, contrary to popular opinion, isn't just a preserve of our large iconic cities, but characterizes many a corner of our suburbs, many a corner of our provincial towns. I can see even in Loughborough it's there. I don't know anything else about Loughborough, but you can sell something. They seem to have sports facilities everywhere. I forgot that. And also, not least, because I'm a media theorist too, the multiculture that characterizes extraordinary many corners of our digital screens and its subsequent effects. Unfortunately, I'll be the first to admit, and I think Tariq would agree with this too, but much academic research about such things unfortunately succumbs very quickly to extremely silly platitudes, descriptive platitudes about diversity in its own right. Much more akin to a kind of liberal corporate politics of representation and not much else. But on the contrary, at least in the tradition of someone like Paul Gilroy, it remains absolutely formative for me, but a lot of younger scholars now, Luc de Neronia's extraordinary book, Deporting Black Britons, but it's actually about the conviviality amidst the brutality of what is otherwise a detention center. Or Ben Rogali's fascinating work on warehouse workers and food processing workers in provincial Peterborough, and the kind of slow multiculture and class awareness that gets forged in the intimacies of their socialization and common inhabitation. Or Amit Singh, another young scholar's excellent work on an East London, on a boxing gym on the outer extremities of East London, and the very particular multiculture that gets cultivated there. And all of these people share fundamentally that multiculture can be many things, but as fundamental as a political stake, we're interested in how it is always about working class mutuality with, through, and across and beyond difference, and how through various forms of social and cultural entanglement, what gradually unfolds is a loosening of the need to always police politics, space, identity, and culture along defensive indices of group identity, not least defensive indices of white English entitlement, white English centrality, white English normativity. And just to end, 30 seconds, just to end, you also did 30 seconds, just to end, and it's in no way I'm not trying to put aside Tariq's work, but what I'm interested in, I do find that there's a new generation of younger, this is the kind of cultural politics that a new generation of anti-racist writing is much more interested in. And a lot more committed to, not about top-down legislative politics, about a set of group rights that a liberal state might afford to minorities. Good Lord, this liberal state scarcely exists now. It's a beleaguered harass on its final, in its final hurrah in any case. But instead, it's about the horizons of everyday horizons of multiracial working class culture that can be harnessed or amplified for better political effect, and also allows us to re-enter the terms of class in ways that rescue it from its current status as a preserve or exclusive preserve of populist, its populist enclosures. And these being horizons that are not about defensive, I'm this group, I'm that group, you have these rights, I'm going to have these rights, a defensive cautiousness, but it's about the affirmative, mutually enchanting unlearning of those very nationalist and racial logics by which we otherwise conceive of political belonging, and not the small matter of shared purpose. That was 30 seconds. Damn, good.
Well, we were hoping for some pugilistic tension to keep the audience alive. 3 days is long. I'll say it's not, so I will leave it to you whether you want to respond, whether you prefer to open Q&A. Would you like to offer response?
I'd like to pick up on a couple.
Yeah, would you mind maybe to open?
I'd ask
Yeah,
you,
you just, we just say.
you would speak from here, maybe people can hear better. Yeah, so I don't want to hog the time even more than Valluvan and I've already done, but I would like to test out a little bit of a response, because you said that there may be, we may be at cross purposes. So I want to try and address that. And you said you weren't interested in ideal theory. I don't think that's true at all. I think you're a lot more idealistic in your theorizing than I am. So I think that I would describe my approach as that we need a normative perspective, you know, we being people who want to understand society, but also to some extent criticize society, to offer alternatives, to offer, if you like, intellectual leadership. We need a normative perspective which has to be argued for in relation to objections and alternatives and so on. That's what I try to do. I would say that how I try to do it, I would characterize it as grounded normative theory. So I don't begin with abstract ideas, or I try to minimize that. I rather work with tendencies in the real world, in Britain, in other countries. And I think that what I was describing as multicultural nationalism, against liberal nationalism, against monocultural nationalism, and so on, these all exist. They all exist in Britain, they all exist in other countries, and it's a matter of developing some to a further stage of coherence and political attractiveness relative to others. So I'm not picking out ideas from the sky or, you know, pure abstractions. I'm working with what we already have in the world. And I would in particular point to, I would say, Britain, Canada, and Australia as probably the three best examples that fit my understanding of debates around multicultural nationalism versus liberal nationalism. And then I emphasized, right at the end, I emphasized feasibility. So how can I be talking about ideal theory? I'm talking about what will work. I'm not interested in what won't work. And in fact, I think a lot of what you say probably wouldn't work because you are so idealistic that you're willing to pitch yourself against society as a whole, against most political possibilities. That's idealism. So I'm a lot more grounded. So if there is a cross purpose, it's not because I am living in some kind of ideal stratosphere. And maybe I just use what you said about Islamophobia as an example, and then sit down. So, I mean, my work on Islamophobia, which doesn't take as much space as my work on multiculturalism in terms of working out its normative connections and political possibilities, but the work on Islamophobia is very important. And I think you acknowledged that it's played a pioneering role. But where I differ from what I might call merely being anti-Islamophobia as part of merely being anti-racist is, okay, identify Islamophobia, see how it works, its structures and processes, find ways of challenging it, but we need an idea of something positive, not just opposing something, but what about positive recognition of Muslims so they have a sense of belonging and a place in British society or German or French or whatever it might be, not just by opposing something, but by making Muslims part of Britain through their own agency, but in a dialogical, cooperative and collaborative way with other people. So that requires some kind of multiculturalist political project and not merely an anti-racist one.
Glad that some pugilistic tension is back. Now we're working on it.
I'm happy to roll back the ideal theory remark. I think it's more that I am much more a conjunctural thinker. So I wouldn't talk about the penalties of how class has been repurposed if I wasn't trying to address very particular contingencies of the political struggles and impasses that I feel I am encountering. So there's a conjuncture in how multiculturalism can be talked about by Kim Licka in 1994, half the time about Quebec, that I'm just thinking that whatever his modeling does not travel, and I'm not particularly interested in thinking that Kim Licka, David Miller, even Kukatas, is that his name? Yes. they can tell us anything about the very particular politics that allow for Brexit, that allow for the repurposing of class identity, that allow for anti-racism both to thrive and to be cut simultaneously. So I'm a conjuncture analyst, that's all. So I cannot, what I will say today will not be what I said in 1952. And what I will say in 2042 is going to be a very different reckoning too. I suspect some of the politics I have today, I would not have had in 1980s. I wouldn't talk about white resentment and revanchist melancholy. I would talk about white supremacy and you're beating us up. You know, that's the conjunctural term. So I'm not saying you are somewhat ungrounded and so on. What I mean is that the terms of contingency are very live to the kind of political questions I'm asking, and at least what I feel, the analytic questions I chase. That's quite a different reckoning. At war with the social world? No, I think I'm at romance with the social world. I'm at romance with the social world. I am interested in multicultural precisely because I find all its frisson, its energy as an extraordinary escape from the suffocating morass and dystopia today. I'm not going to bend to that dystopia. Why would I bend to that dystopia and say I'm in agreement with the social world and I'm a grounded theorist? Am I going to agree with Hindutva, bend to Hindutva when I go back to India and say I'm in agreement with the social world? No, I'm in agreement with another social world that is there and is routinely rehearsed and is being routinely staged. So I'm a romantic sociologist, a romantic cultural theorist, but it's always locked in the particularities of the kind of social exposures that we encounter. I am as much interested in a BLM protest as I'm interested in hip-hop music on TV and how that remakes the working class. I'm as much interested in Marcus Rashford as I'm interested in Paul Gilroy. Not Marcus Rashford pointedly, because of a very particular political rationale that comes out of his ability to claim a stage. A claim about food banks. A claim about food banks, not cultural rights for him. Because it doesn't matter, we know how blackness is criminalized. He can go to he's too rich now, but obviously, his peers can go to a club. The point isn't whether the club is playing black music or not. The point is that when he's going to the club, he's getting criminalized and stopped and searched. That is why I'm interested in racism. And going back to Australia, Canada, and England, I don't know if that, in all honesty, I find that inadequate inspirations, because insofar as I grew up in Sri Lanka, we have multiculturalism. Yes. You know, we have the school holidays you were speaking about. When I was very young, we had Eid holiday, Christmas holiday, Poya every day, every month, the full moon for Buddhists, we had holiday. We have multiculturalism. And guess what? The Buddhist chauvinist Sri Lankan nationalists still showed up and still launched war for 30 years. And the Tamil nationalists also got caught up and insisted on their own nationalist violences. We had multiculturalism the whole time, we still do. I was growing up in a position where you have to show your ID card and tell your Tamil to everyone, to armed checkpoint military guards. My family has been murdered for various reasons. I still got to go to a Tamil curriculum school in Kalam, in Kandy. It's a majority single. You get to choose. You're Tamil, I have a Tamil curriculum school. Our religion classes weren't religion. They were, what is your religion? You get to do it. So we had it, it's so given. India has it, and it doesn't mean Hindutva doesn't show up. So I don't know why we care about Australia. I would care about race in Australia. I'm not sure they have a great staging of that particular question. Well, multiculturalism at that very narrow level can feel very moot to me on those terms. So I'm only taking issue not with your position, I'm taking the issue that I'm not grounded. I'm very grounded on these terms. And to be at war with the social world is very different to be at romance with the social world. But to be at romance with the social world is not to bend to every going trope that it claims for itself. If they want to tell me white working class people are anti-immigration, and permanently socially conservative, that's on them. I don't believe white working class, I use the stupid language now, white working are by default socially conservative and somehow pathologically patriotic at every turn, because they too are the central armies for the multiculture I talk about. So, that's a very different reckoning. Islamophobia, yes, but I talk about it. Islamophobia is about, in my opinion, the scrutiny of a particular background subject to pathological, stereotypical inferences. Because you can have a Sikh school. I have a student who went to a Sikh school. You can have Hindu schools. My family is in Harrow. There are Hindu faith schools. They're not subject to anywhere near the same scrutiny if you open a Muslim school. And how suddenly Prevent shows up. And suddenly everything is audited about terrorist radicalization. I am interested in Islamophobia. I want their lives to be as good as everyone else's life. But the point is, multiculturalism already makes the affordances. Something else is doing the nasty work. The racism shows up. The derogatory, suspect population frame shows up. And it's contingent. The same suspect populations were the Irish. Suspect population is a concept I take from a writer about Irish life in England. Patrick, I forget his first name, Hilliard. Do you remember? Yeah. So it's contingent. Sorry, okay, there we go. Thank you.
I guess now it's time to move away from the pugilistic tension. Sorry, it's my fault. So now it's time to open for Q&A. We are aiming to finish at 45. Obviously, if you need to leave, please do leave. Can we collect questions? We'll collect a few questions, comments that you have, please. David.
So if I can address a question to you, please, Vallu. Your hope for the future is entirely based, or seems largely to be based, amongst interactions amongst the working class, if I've understood what you're saying correctly. Maybe you're more optimistic about things than I am,
Sure.
but it strikes me that there is very, very little class consciousness.
Yes, quite.
And it's going down. If you're actually going to achieve the social world with which you're in romance, it strikes me that you are going, and I suspect you're coming from a far more left-wing position than I am, but it's not going to work just building it on the working class. Question mark.
Right. Can I see whether there are any other questions? Does it relate? Does it connect? Your question? Does it connect? Yeah, yours. Does it connect?
It does.
Yeah, if it does, yes, please go ahead.
So yeah, building up on that,
Can you speak loudly if you can? Sorry.
yeah, building on that, Bella, you were talking about this sort of symbolism of the working class and the white working class, and also avocados. I'm fascinated by why avocados are so important in this. But I'm wondering what does nationalism think the working class is? And it's not come up so much in many of the panels I've been on. How nationalism actually imagines, a real citizen, a real working class citizen, yeah, especially given sort of the actual working class doing the work are often highly multicultural, often not citizens. I think the example I'd give for this, because it's local to me, was the Just Eat Riders strike last year in the year before. It was incredibly multilingual, multinational, multicultural in so many ways, and very obviously just core sort of working cogs of Britain. So.
No, very good.
Right. Any other questions? We have a question for Tariq, but maybe we can go first for the answer. Is there another question? Vallu, you go first.
Excellent. I'll answer that and then that. No, I couldn't agree more, because I think you open up the right visions. Why does nationalism take such an interest? And why, which is essentially a fetish, obviously, a fetish at their expense, because it offers anything but materialist redress. But I think it's a fetish source. Firstly, that's why Paul Gilroy is very important to us. So much of English nationalism is locked into what he calls post-colonial melancholy. And by post-colonial melancholy, he doesn't mean 1920s. He means a kind of, upon independence, a 20-year, 30-year period where the rich motifs of British staging or English staging sorry. in a completely anachronistic way of a worker who looks a certain way and has a certain burning orientation that could be a man of industry even if he never was. And this particular image of the working class becomes the whole subject. And all sorts of the whole subject does distortion work. As you rightly say, any claim to the working class will have to reckon with its disproportionality for minority and certainly migrant labor, which is a very particular question about nationalism, never being able to assess the class question, but it cannot reckon with the migrant question. Secondly, however, it is particularly distorted because their working class symbolism is actually talking about a pensioner class who is the principal voting bloc, a pensioner class who is property owning and usually banking from the late support of the welfare state, the support of a late welfare state and an attached right property. So it is in no way an actual industrial labor or a downtrodden man of Middlesbrough deindustrialization per se, because it assumes usually a particular age bracket, a very particular voting bloc that they're very good at symbolizing. They cannot reckon at any level with a new reconfigured working classes of the tertiary economy, which is obviously going to be much more metropolitan and have very different symbolic affectations. They're often going to be university educated, but who cares? You're university educated in a massified era, over 50% of kids go to university. So you're going to be a university educated who can't get a job, who sits on precarity and is locked out of the property market and only relying on landlord's rent extraction. That is, in the old language, class conflict. In the old dated language, that is class conflict. But it cannot see it as such, because its symbolism is so fetishized. That is the work that avocado does, unfortunately. Because, oh, you went to uni? Oh, you like that? You know, they used to talk about latte drinking liberals or something. I mean, it was so unhinged, this symbolic fetish. And it became outside. I mean, crucially, I couldn't agree more, they can't even deal with their own white working classes. Because they too are going to be constituted by grime music. They too are going to be constituted by the fan culture of the Premier League. I mean, when I got in the taxi here, it wasn't a white English guy, admittedly, but it was blaring Stormzy. He was a 35-year-old Eastern European Uber driver. You know what I mean, man? It's different. And this kind of fetishistic symbolism can't deal with the actual working class that is also being forged, but under recomposed class conflict or the encounter with class conflict. This kind of relates to your point in of course, I'm not this crazy working class idealist. I'm only stressing that today because I think nationalism is doing a very particular work around the working class. If there is, of course, plenty middle class multiculture. Whether I'm really interested, I don't know, because I think it's softened by liberalism and it's softened by kind of lifestyle, cosmopolitan consumerism. But it's there, and if they want to vote a certain way, I'm here for them. But cool, you know. But that doesn't feel to me an overdetermined subject of contemporary nationalist politics. And I agree there is no class consciousness. But I do think in part there is no class consciousness because of the culturalization of class. So I'm interested. We'll have to get through that morass. I'm not saying we'll get there, of course not. I could pretend we would. What else? What's the point of writing otherwise? More woe me, dispiriting, dystopian affirmation. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It doesn't rock my boat.
Okay.
So,
Right.
Maybe I can say something to that theme.
Yes, what do you want to choose?
I mean, just
different understanding of nationalism and nationalism, but not all are the same. So there's an uneven power. Some have more traction, some have considered to be more legitimate. So there is an uneven power in this multiculturality that has to be taken into consideration and acknowledged. So we are not all the same, and not all the measures are. So this is one part. Second point, I think I was a bit confused. I'm not sure whether also some other people here in the audience were confused or not, because you said that nationalism is not about exclusion of others. And first of all, we need to understand what we mean. You call it the normative character of nationalism, and the way you went about somehow different from what a student of nationalism would do. A student of nationalism would mention the state, the territory, the people. You don't even mention the people, just went for state citizenship, belonging, and recognition. But the question is, so is there one single true understanding of the normative character of nationalism? So are you, in a sense, what you picture yourself when you go back and you say, we need to understand the normative character of nationalism, and you find that right? So that is the way it has to be defined? So that would be the question of clarification. Can I see from the audience if there's any points or questions possibly related to this one? Yes.
Building on that, Mr. Modood, I think you could help me a little bit. In your paper, I felt like you moved from an initial discussion of analysis, how to analyze, and then you moved into a normative part where you said what should be. And in that first part, it seemed like to me you were building on a kind of post-structuralist way of thinking, discourse analysis that hovers above the evidentiary. And so it seems like you could ground that much more firmly in some of the cognitive theorists who built on the initial work of the philosopher you mentioned to really talk about how the mind works and how people do these things in their everyday lives. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that and extend that.
Any other question?
Yes, thank you for your questions, Marco, and thank you for yours. Maybe I'll just start with yours because I didn't get a chance to note it down, and therefore still, why is still in my mind. You're quite right. I mean, my whole idea of normative, of multicultural nationalism is normative. So that's, I hope, not in any way disguised or hidden or diluted because I'm totally upfront about that, because I want to actually don't mind that connection, you making that connection, but it's not actually what I was saying, because I was saying there can be different kinds of nationalism. Eric Kaufman, in talking about multiculturality, says that members of the same country, of the same nation, can have different conceptions of what their national identity is. And I think actually he's right about that. So I share that view, but that's not what I was arguing for. In fact, that's the kind of thing we argued for in the report that you mentioned right at the very beginning, The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, where we said that in a country like Britain, there are a number of competing narratives about what it is to be British. And an important part of multicultural politics is exactly the challenging of real chance, a real world chance, not just an abstract ideal hope, a real world chance of building a winning electoral consensus by bringing the pro-diversity and the third in the middle who are not so sure into a winning coalition. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vallu. I think we need to draw the close here given the time. Everybody might go away. So please join me